Boa noite. Sejam muito bem-vindas, muito bem-vindos. Sou Isaías Francisco de Carvalho, professor do Departamento de Letras e Artes da Universidade Estadual de Santa Cruz, UESC. Integro a comissão do evento 6º Language Week and First International Symposium on Language Teacher Education. O evento vem acontecendo desde o dia 24, foi 24 ontem, e hoje, 27 de setembro, ou 26 de setembro hoje. Só um momentinho. Tecnologia não é o nosso forte. Você poderia vir aqui e dar uma olhada? Não, já consegui me resolver com a tecnologia e agora o evento tem acontecido pela manhã, pela tarde, pela noite, com atividades presenciais aqui na UESC, semipresenciais, híbridas, dos 3 campi da UFSB e atividades virtuais. A conferência de encerramento atual, intitulada Professional Literary Translation and Teacher Education, Tradução Literária e Formação Docente, é uma realização do projeto de extensão Dinamizando o Ensino da Língua Inglesa na UESC e do Programa de Extensão Formação de Professores de Línguas, FORPROLI, da UFSB, da queridíssima Suelen e demais membros, e do Programa de Extensão FORPROLI, como disse, com o apoio dos colegiados, IACs, departamentos e pró-reitorias da UESC e da UFSB. Durante as falas, vocês podem enviar perguntas por meio do chat do YouTube, para quem nos acompanha virtualmente, ou aguardar o final das falas para direcionar a sua pergunta à professora convidada, para quem está aqui no auditório da UESC. Sugerimos que escrevam a palavra pergunta em letras minúsculas antes de seu questionamento, para facilitar a visualização. As perguntas serão repassadas no final da discussão. Não esqueçam de assinar a lista de presença, o link será frequentemente repostado no chat do YouTube para quem estiver no presencial, o QR Code será divulgado pela equipe de monitoria. Fiquem atentos. Então, começamos agora essa conferência de encerramento, Professional Literary Translation and Teacher Education, Tradução Literária Profissional e Formação Docente, apresentando a Dr. Martha Witt, e eu vou ler em inglês o perfil dela, mas em português adianto que ela é da William Patterson University, em New Jersey, na Nova Jersey, Estados Unidos. Ela tem feito parceria com a gente aqui da UESC há muito tempo. Inclusive, ofereceu recentemente oficina de Creative Writing aqui no nosso PPGL. Martha Witt grew up in Hillsborough, North Carolina, the setting of her first novel. She has received grants from the New York Times Foundation as well as the Thomas J. Watson Foundation and has held residencies at the Yaddo Ragdale VCCA in Asia Artist Colonies, as well as at the Casa delle Traduzioni in Rome. Her translations and short stories have appeared in several literary journals and anthologies. Martha is currently a professor of creative writing at William Patterson University, and she lives in New York City with her husband, daughter, son, and dog. Actually, daughter and son right now are traveling abroad, but eventually they'll come back to New York. In 2023, Martha was in Ilhéus through the Fulbright Scholar Program as a guest professor at the graduate program in Letters, Languages and Representations at Universidade Estadual de Santa Cruz, nosso PPGL UESC. Foi aqui, como eu disse, que ela deu oficina de Creative Writing. E temos também a professora... Martha Witt está, então, virtualmente com a gente, mas a professora Paula está presencialmente aqui. Eu convido para sentar aqui. Paula Tavares, doutora Paula Tavares Pinto, que vai sentar aqui ao meu lado, que é professora associada, vinculada ao Departamento de Letras Modernas da Universidade Estadual Paulista, Júlio de Mesquita Filho, Unesp, campus de São José do Rio Preto, onde atua na graduação e no programa de pós-graduação em estudos linguísticos. Eu vou quebrar o protocolo e fazer o seguinte: na hora que você for falar, eu vou terminar de ler o seu currículo. Por enquanto, vamos ouvir a professora Martha Witt. Confere, produção. Diretamente de Nova York. Professora Martha, pode me ouvir? Just a moment. Então, estamos aguardando conexões tecnológicas para a professora Martha Witt começar a sua fala, lá de Nova York. Mas eu tenho certeza que ela preferiria estar em Ilhéus. Mas é menos frio, bem menos frio, não é? Enquanto isso, eu também poderia traduzir parte do currículo dela. Bom, ela é romancista, professora Martha. Você consegue me ouvir, professora Martha? Muito mal. Então, a gente vai ajustar aqui. Ou então... Só um momento. Você consegue me ver, Martha? Não. Acho que não também. Mas já estão me ouvindo melhor? Não. Eu vou ficar. Now I think you can see me.
I can see you. Hi.
E o volume. Ela vai ter volume para a gente ouvir aqui no monitor. Okay. Well, finally, it's nice to see you, Martha.
It's good to see you.
Although I cannot hear you.
Oh, you can't?
Well, yet, but this is going to be adjusted in a moment.
Okay.
Technical issues.
Yeah. There are always those.
Então, devo dizer que ela vai começar.
Tudo que você vai falar. Se você entendeu?
Eu acho que muito tarde para fechar o áudio. Eu acho que agora é o seguinte: diante da gafe, o professor Marco fala agora.
Okay, I'll start, right? Should I start? Can you hear me? Go ahead and start. Okay. So, first of all, thank you all for coming here, and thanks to Professor Isaías and Professora Valkyria for inviting me back. In the spring of 2023, I was awarded a Fulbright to work on a novel and teach a creative writing course at UESC. I also had the privilege of returning last May and have such fond memories of the students, faculty, and everybody else in general. And it's really been a pleasure attending this conference, even if virtually, to teach a 2-day workshop on the pedagogy of creative writing, and also to be part of this panel on translation and teaching. So in the United States, I teach literature, creative writing, and courses in the pedagogy of writing to graduate and undergraduate students at William Patterson University in New Jersey. And in these courses, we look very closely at words and at the rhetorical choices that writers make when composing a story. So we ask questions such as, how does the alteration of a single word reverberate in a sentence to affect meaning? What is transmitted by a phrase or word aside from meaning? And how does sentence length and or punctuation influence our reading? How much should a writer consider audience? What do these considerations entail? And such questions undergird all writing. The more literary the writing, the more pertinent the questions. Writers tell a story by choosing words and composing sentences. Translators evaluate each sentence within the larger meaning of the text, then narrow the focus to evaluate each word. As we know, words do so much more than merely transmit meaning. In fact, before we get into the nitty-gritty of literary translation, I want to engage you in one of my favorite language experiments. And some of you already may be familiar with this slide. So you should be seeing in front of you a slide with two big shapes. So the slide has two figures. So one is sharp and pointy, and the other is cloud-like. And I want you to match the sound of the word kiki with one figure, with one shape, and the sound of booba with the other shape. Go ahead and get that in your heads, and then maybe Professor Isaías can tell me with a show of hands, how many think that kiki belongs to the round shape and booba to the jagged shape? And how many think kiki belongs to the jagged shape and booba to the rounder shape? And maybe somebody can tell me that information, if you were able to glean it. Okay, so I'm just going to go with what I assume happened. So this psychological experiment, first performed in 1924, has been performed many times since and across a majority of cultures and languages, ranging from English-speaking Americans to Tamil speakers in India, and even speakers of certain languages with no writing system. The experiment has also been performed on young children, infants, and even the congenitally blind. So across language systems and cultures, the vast majority of people like you associated the spiky shape with kiki and the round shape with booba. Furthermore, people have a more positive feeling about the bulbous nonsense word booba than the jagged nonsense word kiki. But why is this experiment relevant to the work of translation? So let's consider the verb to translate, which derives from the Latin translatio, primarily meaning a carrying across or a transferring. Importantly, words are carried across from the original language rather than simply changed into the target language. In carrying words across, one should be careful whenever possible to maintain qualities of those words that go beyond meaning. So I hope that you guys were able to see this slide earlier when I was talking about kiki and booba. And the way that people relate kiki to that spiky one and booba to that round one across all cultures. It's a very interesting experiment. So reading a text draws on all our senses, and our innate synesthesia, whether covert or overt, is always present, binding us together no matter our linguistic heritage, a phenomenon you just witnessed with this experiment. As you are all aware, there are several approaches to carrying one text across into another, and it is important that I contextualize my own approach. So coming to translation as a creative writer, not a linguist or a theorist, my translation work can be summed up in the desire to link two worlds through deep attention to language and through the commonalities across languages. Our relationship to sounds, rhythms, nuances that already join us at a very basic level, even if you do not speak or understand each other's language. Italo Calvino once stated that one reads a book only when one translates it. This deep reading presents all translators with an incredible gift. There is no better way to learn about writing than to join a writer you admire in her rhythms, sentence structures, and aesthetics. Often, that slide will come later, actually, but often translators are viewed as the handmaidens to the original author's work. But any writer who translates knows the luxury of actually being able to inhabit another writer's intimate space. As the writer and translator Lydia Davis has stated, when I'm translating, I feel as though I'm the writer. I feel very much like it's my text until I run into a problem. The most fortunate writers are those who get to translate. And I feel doubly fortunate because I do not translate alone. I work with my mother, Dr. Mary Ann Frazee-Witt, Professor Emeritus of Italian and French Literature. My mother approaches translation from a more theoretical perspective, often leading us to debate and discuss how best to render a particular passage. I tend to lean towards a freer approach to translating, and she tends to argue for adhering to a more literal translation. We generally meet somewhere in the middle. Together, we have translated several short stories by contemporary Italian authors, as well as 3 plays by Luigi Pirandello and 2 novels by Grazia Deledda, both writers who received Nobel Prizes. We are currently in the process of completing a translation of Deledda's novel, appropriately titled, considering our duo, La Madre, and tentatively translated as His Mother. Unlike my co-translator, my mom, I am not steeped in translation theory. I come to a text with the approach of a creative writer interested in how various word choices reverberate differently within a sentence. I work to bring into the target language the nuance stemming from my interpretation, along with the rhythms, sounds, and cultural connotations of the original. Admittedly, my interpretation of the text will dictate many seemingly small choices, one preposition over another, whether a lone paragraph is warranted or not, or whether to add or change formatting to better match with conventions more familiar to an English-speaking readership. The translatio that takes into account these multiple considerations not only separates one translator from another, but also separates the human translator from the AI version. Now, there's a great deal, of course, to be said about the use of AI in translation, and the more sophisticated AI becomes, the more the human translator's relevance is thrown into question. I'm in no position to predict what technology holds in store for us. I know translators who are purists, refusing to use any AI. I am not one of those. When I consult the dictionary, I might also consult DeepL or ChatGPT in search of the broadest range of possibilities for a word or a phrase. But the most crucial part of my translating, the interpretation, my emotional connection to the sounds of the words that guide my choices, along with those other aspects of language that include but also go beyond meaning, remains all human. An AI translation is a reading and an interpretation of sorts, accomplished by a machine. It does not experience synesthesia or instinctively pair shapes with sounds, as you all so easily accomplished earlier this evening. It cannot, therefore, and cannot by definition ever, accomplish a human interpretation. Of course, this fact can never change. So on to Grazia Deledda, author of La Madre, which was first published in Italian in 1926 and followed by Mary Steegman's English translation in 1928. Grazia Deledda, 1871 to 1936, spent the first 30 years of her life in the town of Nuoro on the island of Sardinia. Although her native language was a Sardinian dialect, she wrote entirely in Italian. By the late 19th century, women writers had become well known and popular in England, the United States, France, and even Italy, but the idea of a woman writing in Sardinia was shocking and certainly not encouraged. As a teenager, Deledda, whose only formal education was elementary, began to write stories set in Sardinia and based on her family and people in her environs. Although she spent the major part of her career in Rome, much of her creative work continued to be rooted in the landscape, characters, and customs of her native land. Deledda knew that to further her writing career, she would have to go to Rome or Milan. She also knew that she could never make such a move as a single woman. So at the age of 28, already considered an old maid, Deledda married Palmiro Madesani and the couple moved to Rome. Once settled in the city, Madesani became effectively his wife's business manager and promoter. He was heavily satirized by Luigi Pirandello in his novel Suo Marito, published in 1911, and translated as Her Husband by Martha King and Marianne Frazee Witt in 2000. In Rome, Deleda maintained a schedule devoted to domestic duties in the mornings and writing in the afternoon. By 1904, Deleda had 2 children and declared her first interest to be maternity. Nonetheless, she went on to publish over 40 novels, in addition to plays, poetry, hundreds of short stories, and even a screenplay. She was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1926, the second woman to receive this award and the first Italian woman to have done so. She died 10 years later in 1936. In Italy, Deleda's novels were initially classified as belonging entirely to Verismo, the Italian version of realism or naturalism, associated with the Sicilian Giovanni Verga, 1840 to 1922. Anglophone readers of Deleda's novels have been influenced by D.H. Lawrence, whose interest in Sardinia dated from his novel Sea in Sardinia, 1921, and who wrote a preface to Mary Steedman's translation of La Madre, which she titled The Woman and the Priest, and published in 1928. Lawrence states that Deleda creates the passionate complex of a primitive populace. In line with his own interests, Lawrence is of the opinion that the primitive, isolated society depicted by Deleda is governed by the rigid conventions of barbarism, at the same time the fierce violence of the instinctive passions. Deleda portrays instinctive sexuality frustrated by barbaric along with Catholic conventions, Lawrence says, comically extending the notion of instinctive to the Italian language itself when discussing the difficulties of translating La Madre into English. He writes, in the mouths of the simple people, Italian is a purely instinctive language, almost impossible to reproduce in the more cut and dried northern languages. Although Lawrence's remarks on the conflict between instinctual passion and societal rules in Deleda's work are to some extent valid, his portrayal of Sardinia as barbaric and isolated neglects the island's complex 4,000-year-old history. He reinforced a view of Deleda's work that prevailed for some time, pigeonholing her as a purely Sardinian writer, uninterested in plot, character, and a more universal exploration of themes and emotions. In fact, despite her popularity in Italy and being awarded a Nobel, Deleda's work has not had the enthusiastic following in English that her male contemporaries such as Giovanni Verga and Luigi Pirandello have enjoyed. That, fortunately, is beginning to change. So it's important to point out that Deleda herself was a translator. Not only had she translated Balzac's Eugénie Grandet into Italian in 1930, but her own works are, in a sense, translations from her mother tongue Sardo. Of course, writing in Italian rather than her native dialect facilitated Deleda's early national success, but her work is often threaded with Sardinian songs, poetry, and expressions, and her phrasing in Italian is certainly influenced by the musicality of her native dialect. Deleda's Italian carries over the sounds and rhythms from her Sardinian. A successful English translation should not only evoke the Italian, but also the musicality of the Sardinian, so intrinsic to Deleda's portrayal and introduction of that island to mainland Italy. As part of our effort to preserve Deleda's distinctive sounds and rhythms, we have chosen in our past 2 translations of her novels, as we choose with this one, to retain Sardinian phrasing when it appears because it lends its own musicality to the page. Where relevant, we create footnotes in English. Where an understanding of the Sardinian phrasing is not relevant to the text, we do not footnote, but choose instead to allow the musicality of the Sardinian to take precedence over the meaning. Again, as you saw with Kiki and Buba, so much remains in a word even when it is divorced of meaning. In fact, one of the great pleasures and challenges in translating Deleda is the sense of navigating these 2 languages of the original text while attempting to carry over the foreign culture into the familiar one. His La Madre, his mother, is considered one of Deleda's most accomplished novels and includes many of her recurring themes: passion, love, religion, death, and morality. The narrative takes place over the space of only 3 days. Set in a small parish of R, which lies under a curse, the story begins with a young priest named Paolo, who has fallen desperately in love with Agnese, a woman in his parish. The real protagonist of the story, though, is Paolo's mother, Maria Magdalena, who, in trying to rescue Paolo from the dangers of his earthly passion, must wrestle with her own questions about love, both human and divine. So I thought we might look, and the slide is there, at a couple of examples showcasing the difference between our current translation of La Madre and the only other existent translation in English by Mary Steegman. It is important to note that Steegman is British and that her translation was published in 1928, part of why we decided it was time for an updated version. First of all, we had difficulty translating the title, La Madre, perhaps closer in connotation to a mãe in Portuguese. You all can tell me if that's true. It's just not accurately translatable as the mother in English. In Italian, I might, speaking about my own mother, state, La madre ha detto, just as in Portuguese, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I might say, a mãe falou, referring to my own mother. On the other hand, I could not be referring to my own mother if I said, the mother said in English. There's just not that intimacy there. Mary Steegman solves this problem with an addition, but her title, The Mother and the Priest, though hinting at the story, struck us as too far afield from De Leda's original, which connotes a relationship between La Madre and as yet unnamed character. We eventually decided on his mother, though this may still change. Other considerations might be best illustrated by looking closely at the first few lines of the novel. So this is the original from 1920. Anche quella notte, dunque, Paolo si disponeva ad uscire. La madre nella sua camera attigua a quella di lui lo sentiva muoversi furtivo, aspettando forse per uscire che le spegnesse il lume e si coricasse. This is Steegman. Tonight again, Paolo is preparing to go out, it seemed. From her room adjoining his, the mother could hear him moving about furtively, perhaps waiting to go out until she should have extinguished her light and got into bed. And this is our translation. And so that night, too, Paolo was preparing to go out. His mother in the adjoining room could hear him tiptoeing around, perhaps waiting for her to turn off the lamp and go to bed before he left. The anche that De Leda uses in that first sentence begins the novel in media res. Though sentences in proper English don't generally begin with and so, we wanted to give the sense of the readers being thrust into the middle of events the way the Italian suggests. We began the second sentence with his mother, thus hearkening back to the title and emphasizing the mother-son relationship so central to the plot. Compare the antiquated English of Steegman's moving about furtively with a much more contemporary and U.S. English, tiptoeing around. De Leda begins the next sentence with La Madre, and since the protagonist's name, Maria Magdalena, is rarely used in the text, yet her role as his mother is prominent, De Leda's original word order seemed important to maintain. Steegman's Until She Should Have pegs this translation as an antiquated British one, and the word extinguished introduces a far different tone than turn off. So illume can be translated as either light or lamp, and there's something metaphorically lovely about extinguished her light as opposed to turned off her lamp. But these are simple people, and the register of the former seems too high. In addition, the word lamp maintains the soft M of lume, as well as its appearance on the page, which seems important to me. We are only 2 sentences into the novel, and look at how many choices we've had to make. So perhaps this is why it's taken us about 2 years, and we're not even we're not finished translating yet. Observe, too, how these choices, though not significantly altering the basic meaning, create a very different text in each translation. As we've already discussed, translation entails a constant negotiation, including between the translators and the writer's aesthetics, both personal and cultural. De Leda's sentences, like contemporary Italian prose, tend to be longer than their English counterparts. Unsurprisingly, De Leda's use of punctuation reflects the conventions of her time. Like her early and mid-20th century English and American contemporaries, De Leda adhered to more formal, structured sentence construction than do writers working today. Like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and William Faulkner, De Leda favored colons and semicolons. In the late 20th and 21st century, writing, at least in English, has trended towards shorter, more concise sentences. As translators, we consistently negotiate whether or not to break up longer sentences or to maintain the structure more representative of De Leda's style. In general, we opt for the former, though I can certainly appreciate an argument for keeping the punctuation that best reflects De Leda's time period. Often, however, keeping the colon in the translated version would muddy the meaning of the English sentence, and so we opt for clarity. In addition, there are certain recurring phrases that pose problems because, like la madre, there's no good English equivalent. For example, phrases like le sembrava or lo sembrava, which are peppered throughout de Leda's prose and carry more nuanced meanings than their direct English translation, it seemed to her or it seemed to him. De Leda uses these expressions to reflect a character's deeper subjective perception or emotional state. The verb sembrare suggests not just a simple observation, but an internalized feeling or impression. For instance, le sembrava can imply that the way something appears is influenced not only by external factors, but also by the character's emotions, desires, or fears. The English, it seemed to her, does not capture the breadth of emotional or psychological subtleties in that le sembrava. Therefore, we consider separately each sentence in which these phrases appear and perhaps translate them differently, depending on the context. There are other points in the text when my personal aesthetics come into play. So, for example, De Leda overuses, for my taste, adjectives. She also has an abiding love of the verb tremava, trembled, a verb I instinctively dislike in prose, a glint of the romanticism in De Leda's work. Mostly, I am able to override my objections, making the choices in English that I believe best represent De Leda's text as I have described. But the most ardent debates my mother and I engage in, around translation anyway, usually center on my more liberal approach to translating a text. As will likely become clear during the next talk and our discussions this evening, there's little about the art of translating that all translators can agree upon. Perhaps, though, most would agree with John Ciardi, a quote frequently attributed to Umberto Eco, actually, who said, "Translation is the art of failure." But there is a splendid quality to that failure, which is intrinsic to art as it is to communication and, in fact, to all human endeavors, continues to connect us across cultures, languages, and eras. Thank you so much. Thank you for the emojis, the clapping, the virtual clapping.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Martha. Muito obrigado, professora Marta, por compartilhar. Okay. Okay, now it's working. Kind of. Well, thank you, Dr. Martin. Questions will be after Dr. Paula. Mas de que adianta ela ouvir? Okay. Okay, now it's Dr. Paula Tavares Pinto's turn, mas vamos ler, vou terminar de ler a apresentação da professora Paula em português. Professora Paula é livre-docente em tradução e ensino de línguas baseado em corpora, possui mestrado e doutorado em estudos linguísticos, com estágio PDEE-CAPES na Universidade de Manchester, Inglaterra. Realizou um pós-doutorado na Universidade de Surrey, também na Inglaterra, sob a supervisão de Ana Frankenberg Garcia, e outro na Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, PUC, sob supervisão de Tony Berber Sardinha. Em 2023, foi pesquisadora visitante na University of Queensland, Austrália, Bolsa Capacitação CAPES, Sprint, Unesp, onde publicou um livro sobre Data Driven Learning com Peter Crosswaite. E pesquisadores do PPGEL da Unesp. É formada em Letras com habilitação em tradução e licenciatura em letras e possui especialização em estudos avançados da língua inglesa. Atualmente coordena o Centro de Línguas e Desenvolvimento de Professores, CLDP, e o projeto de English Teaching Assistants Capsule Bright no campus de São José do Rio Preto. É bolsista de produtividade em pesquisa do CNPq, lidera o grupo de pesquisa Corpora, ensino baseado e dirigido por Corpora, e é membro dos grupos de tradução, terminologia e Corpora, e grupo de estudos de linguística de Corpus GELC. Suas áreas de interesse são estudos da tradução, terminologia, ensino e aprendizagem de língua inglesa, inglês para fins específicos e acadêmicos, linguística de corpos, aprendizagem movida por dados ou data-driven learning. Como é que a gente consegue tudo isso? Então, professora, obrigado, sua vez.
Ok, muito obrigada, professor, pela apresentação. Eu fui informada que eu deveria passar, então, agora para o inglês, né? Então,
pode misturar.
Tá joia, muito obrigada. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very nice event. Congratulations. There are so many people participating, and I know how hard it is to organize an event like that, online and face-to-face. So, congratulations. I would like to start by thanking as well Professors Valquíria Teixeira, Renato Peruso, Suelen Martins, and Sônia Cruz for welcoming me in the name of the organizing committee, as well as Professor Isaías, who I have just met. So in this talk, I'm going to talk briefly about two umbrella projects, major projects. One is coordinated by me on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in research and teaching. And the second one is coordinated by Professor Inês Signorini at Unicamp, whose focus is to help students and researchers to get more acquainted with online tools and corporate tools. Right. So I come, as Professor Isaías mentioned, I come from São Paulo State University, which is a multi-campus university in the state of São Paulo. And the campus where I work is in São José do Rio Preto, in the northeast of São Paulo. Next one. Right. So you can go on. For those who are not aware and who don't know much about the United Nations 2030 agenda, this is a huge agenda by the United Nations with several goals, but the main goal is ending poverty, improving health and education, reducing inequality and spurring economic growth, as well as tackling climate change and preserving oceans and forests. So many different goals, which are systematized in 17 SDGs in the next slide. So maybe you have already seen this picture, and as you can see, there are several issues that are dealt with in the Sustainable Development Goals, including no poverty, zero hunger, quality in education, which is goal number 4, and others related to the sustainable environment. In the next slide, you have all the studies that will be the basis for the work that I'm going to present, which are majorly focus on corpus linguistics and translation studies, academic writing in corpora, and data-driven learning. For those who are not acquainted with corpus linguistics, it's the study of language based on large collections of real-life language used in stored corpora, in huge databases with lots of information, lots of texts, And I highlighted here large collections because we are going to see that nowadays we can work with large collections of texts and small corpora as well. Tony Beber Sardinha has this publication from 2002 and 2004, in which he divides the size of different corpora, which are collections of texts. So for him, a small corpus would have between 8,000 to less words, a medium corpus from 2,050 words to 1 million, and a large corpus from 10 million to more. However, Coaster also adds that a small corpus will be the one used by researchers who work individually and know about what they want, know about their research questions, and sometimes, for example, they will include one book, one novel as one corpus, a small corpus, and we're going to see about that. So corpus-based translation studies and translation training, that's my area, that's where I work at UNESP. I teach English to translation students and future language students. So I have this two-fold focus in my research. Mona Baker in 1993, 1996, and 2001, who is an Egyptian researcher, stated that translated texts record genuine communicative events, and they are neither inferior nor superior to authentic material, but they have their own characteristics. So she suggested the compilation of a huge corpus of 10 million words called the Translational English Corpus text, in which she had several texts in fiction, biography, news, and in-flight magazines. Those were only translated texts into English, not the original ones. And that's what she wanted to show, that translated texts had their own way of being written compared to texts that were originally written in English. And then she called 4 different features of translation as universals of translation, which were simplification, explicitation, normalization, and leveling out. And then in 2004, Team Scott organized and launched this tool to be used by individual researchers. It's Wordsmith Tools, now with different versions. I think it's in the 8th or 9th version, with different functionalities. Basically Concord, which makes concordance lines with a search word, keywords, which will show the most frequent words in a corpus being analyzed, and word lists with all the words from text organized in frequency and in statistics. We're going to see some of that information. So in 2004, Ribeiro, who is professional translator and a researcher, suggested that it would be ideal to have corpus tools being used in translation offices together with translators tools such as Tradus, WordFast, and Unitext, which are CAT tools used by professional translators. That's because it usually takes a long time for a translator to become specialized in one area. And if you know how to use corpus tools, you can quickly compile a database in different areas, for example, medicine or chemistry, and then you can extract the terms in one afternoon or even less, which would take a long time for professional translators. So we have been using those tools together in the translation teaching course that we have at UNESP. And here we have an example of a translation of an app that was launched by the extension provost, PROEC, in which we translated the projects to English and now to French. All the projects that are developed by UNESP in the different cities, they are based on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the students translated those summary of projects to be inserted in this app that is open and is accessible to anyone. So we followed some steps, 4 steps. First of all, we compiled a corpus on the Sustainable Development Goals reports. Then we extracted the terms to English and French. We compiled a glossary, English, Portuguese, French, Portuguese, and then we inserted these glossaries into the CAT tools. Here you can see the next one. Yeah, you can see the website of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And it's very small, but yeah. So you can see on the corner that on the right corner that you have the reports in French, English, Spanish, Mandarin, but you do not have that in Portuguese. So we organized these glossaries from English and French to Portuguese. And then we inserted the glossaries in this corpus tool called Sketch Engine, which is a huge platform with different corpora. And we extracted the terms related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Next one. So here we have the terms in French. As you can see, quickly we extracted some terms such as durable, développement, objectif mondial, which are words connected to the SDGs. And then we organized this collaborative corpus-based glossary that was built by students. And then we inserted it into WordFast. Next one. So for those who are not very familiar with this tool, you have on the right the text which is being translated. And then in the bottom here, you have the terms that were inserted by the students. So in here we have globally, pre-industrial, and other terms that were extracted from the reports and inserted into this tool. So in the end, translation students have learned how to compile a specialized corpus and extract terms from it. They learned how to work individually and collaboratively. They discussed the positive and negative aspects of using corpus tools and CAT tools. So they developed their own instrumental competence, bilingual competence, and translation competences. Now, changing a little bit the focus from translation to English for academic purposes, we have a colleague from the chemistry department who talked to us about the problem that he had found out about students translating terms from English to Portuguese and the other way around, but with different possibilities that were not used by specialists. So, for example, here we have high-performance liquid chromatography, which was translated in 3 different ways, and organophosphate and organophosphorus translated to one term in Portuguese. So Souza analyzed these terms, as well as in the next slide, the one on malathion, which is an organophosphorus pesticide, which had been translated into 4 different ways, right? Which is a problem, because when you have the suffix on, like in Portuguese, malation, and then malationa, malation with M, malation, they may infer that the component that is used does not have sulfur, which is a problem of, it can lead to poisoning. So Souza analyzed these terms, and then we went to the classroom to show students the problem that they would have if they continued translating that way. People who are on YouTube will not see now, but CorpusMate is a tool with a large collections of academic texts, and you can, for example, look for context of malathion. So we have been using this tool in the chemistry course, so students will read about different components in chemistry and be aware on how they can use those terms in English and then in Portuguese. On the other hand, on the next slide, we have VersaText, which is another tool that is used with one text, for example. So they can use one research paper in this tool, and they will see all the combinations, and as well as different verbs, different nouns, which can be used in general English and academic English as well. Can go on. Yeah, they can see the different function words, content words, and the word cloud as well. So finally, next one. Students have learned that terms cannot be simply translated, but must be researched in academic texts and in institutions such as UPAC and CAS, because they have a formal registration. They learned how to compare the use of terms in Portuguese and in English, taking into account representative corpora in their area, and they became familiar with corpora tools and used those with user-friendly tools. So they have become detectives of language, which is the main principle of DDL, data-driven learning. So now, leading to the last part of this talk, data-driven learning is a teaching approach that, in a way, we inserted in different courses, and it will help students to understand and identify pattern-based approach concerning vocabulary and grammar. So they will be able to identifying patterns in language and use them when they have to read or when they have to write their own research papers or abstracts and other texts in English. They will explore the corpora, which are databases of language, and it will help them reach higher order thinking skills based on Bloom's taxonomy. So they will not only read, but they will ask questions, and they will research about those questions in concerning the language they are learning. So that leads to corpus literacy. And then we have activities that are considered hands-on and hands-off. Hands-on is when you take the students to the lab and they will explore those collections of texts. Hands-off is when the teacher will bring the exercise to class based on those collections of texts. Here you can see, for example, two different word clouds based on the research papers written by Brazilian researchers in English, where you see the words sustainability and poverty. As you can see, Brazilian researchers have discussed sustainability a lot, but they have discussed poverty less in their research papers. So students read the word cloud. They also saw the words that were co-current to sustainability and poverty. So they could see that, for example, Sustainability is being discussed as concept, phenomenon, and in different ways as coastal, sub-regional areas, geographic point of view. With poverty, they could see that Brazilian researchers were discussing quilombolas, eco-village, so in a way, traditional and modern concepts of groups. And then they produced their own texts. So in this case, they were students of letras, right? Future language teachers. And what we did is we wanted to show them how those tools can be used so that they can produce their own teaching materials, as well as encourage students to ask questions to those collections of texts. So they produced texts based on the reports from ONU, from the United Nations. For example, here we have Valuing Local Products, Seeds Bank in Brazil, is it also possible? Brazil Hunger Levels. So this is a way to bring important issues, not only in the world. Now it's a different movement coming from the world to the classroom and to Brazil, right? So discussing important issues in their own community as well. And then we published this book called Using Language Data to Learn About Language, me and the research group Incorpora, in which we have data-driven activities using corpus tools in different teaching contexts. Now I don't think I will have much time. I think I have 2 minutes, maybe 3. Okay. Right? So for those who would like to take a look, the book is available online. You have lesson plans, and you have, lesson plans and videos showing how the tools work. But the last part here, next one, it's the evaluation of those tools, because this is where we reach a point that people have not discussed so much. We are using those tools. Are they being used for? Are they working for you? So we wanted to know if teachers were using them. And then we have those graphs that show that how clear was, for example, lesson 1 to you. Most of the users say that it was clear, but not everyone. How useful was lesson 1 to you? The next one. Next. And then, do you plan to implement lesson 1 to your class? Not everyone's, only 64%. I mean, not only, but 64% said that they would, 28% that maybe, and the others no, or in a different way, they would adapt those tools. And then finally, what did you like about lesson 1? They talked about the website, the examples, that there were several examples. But then in the next slide, what did you like least about lesson 1 and working with that tool? Having to work in pairs, which is not related to the tool, but to working in pairs. And then some of them didn't like parts of the lesson. They thought it could be clearer. So as final remarks, teachers and students can gain insights into how language is used in different contexts. They can also have clear guidance on how they can use corpus data to create their lessons and to develop a better understanding of language. Different classroom settings can be also used, for hands-on and hands-off activities. And teachers can improve their lesson planning using this material and preparation. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I hope you have enjoyed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Paula. I have a question that could be addressed to both of you and Martha. It's like, how would you stimulate or motivate people into translation today? I say that because it's very little, there is virtually zero research on translation here, for example, in our university. But and in Brazil as a whole, I think it's not very different. Maybe some specific universities and programs, but is translation becoming like an uninteresting area of research and practice? What do you think? And what could you tell the audience and young people to engage in this field of translation? I don't know how this question could reach Professor Martha, because if I turn on my, I don't know, if you manage to have her get this question to, like, how is it in the US? Do they have a lot of programs in translation? Is it an active field of research and practice? Because here it is not. Or
should I answer first or Professor Martha? I don't know if she has.
Is available?
She's available, but she's not listening to you.
But if I turn on the... Yes, you. But okay.
Professora Paula can answer.
Now we can hear you. The question is, what would you recommend to young people or to motivate people into translation? I think she's not listening.
No, she's listening now.
Okay.
Now she's not there.
Yes, she left.
She just left.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Isaías, for the question, because translation is my starting point. In São José do Rio Preto, we have a very relevant course of translation. Students are very much motivated, not only students of translation, but students of languages as well, and literature, especially. And I could not talk about that, but one of the main areas of research that I worked on, and Valkyria as well, is on literary translation, I mean, the research group. So, for example, students in England, they were reading Clarice Lispector, which is not a very easy author to be read, and they found very easy to understand. So there was a researcher who wanted to see how come students were reading Clarice Lispector and finding it easy. So the translation was the way, you know. So many researchers have analyzed how Clarice Lispector, Jorge Amado, and I'm surprised to know that this is not a very common area here, because Jorge Amado is translated to many different languages, and there are several studies as well on how to translate cultural aspects of language, such as food, religion, and so on. So it's a rich, wonderful area to be researched, right? And nowadays in my research specifically, we have been working on how we can use translation in the language classes, especially when we have big groups, as I talked to yesterday. Translation can be used as a tool to help students to learn and reach a higher level in their language. If, depending on the area, it will be one step ahead, you know. before reaching a higher proficiency. So I'd say that translation is very much welcome in language classes as well as the fifth skill. And in research areas, thinking about literary work. I think that would be, I don't know if I answered, I hope so. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your answer. And now I hope Professor Martha can also. I wrote the question. So she knows she could speak now, for example.
I'm getting terrible delays, so I don't know if this will come through. You can hear me? So I'll just say it quickly because, but my perspective is that anyone interested in writing, anyone interested in becoming a creative writer should definitely participate in translation, because it's really through translation, particularly of writers that you admire, that you get into that intimate space of a writer's head, and you understand how that person makes certain choices, and it's the best teaching tool there is. So to me, anybody who wants to experiment creatively for themselves, once they've had that training of sitting down with another writer's thoughts and words and rhythms, they will expand their own vocabulary and breadth of possibility for their own writing. So yeah, to me, that's one of the most beautiful pieces of translation is that what it offers in that regard.
Okay, with Martha's answer, we have both topics, creative writing and translation, together. That was good. Well, Professor Martha cannot hear me, but thank you, Professor Martha. Thank you, Professor Paula. And Okay, thank you, Professor Martha. Your answer put together translation and creative writing. But we are now closing this session. And we thank you very much again and again. E now em português, vamos para encerrada esta conferência de encerramento, pedindo desculpas leves pelo aprendizado tecnológico que estamos tendo ao vivo. Agradecemos a todas pela participação e contribuições, principalmente, de novo, as professoras conferencistas, professora Martha Witt, da Universidade de William Patterson University de Nova Jersey, e a professora Paula Tavares Pinto, da UESC e de vários outros lugares. Agradecemos pelo diálogo e pelo apoio técnico da UESC, que é o UFSB. Ok, queremos imediatamente a seguir a cerimônia de encerramento, para a qual convido as professoras e professores Suelen Tomás de Aquino Martins, Valquíria França Teixeira e Sônia Maria Chacaliasso Cruz. Obrigado. E o professor Renato Gonçalves Peruso, a quem presto especiais agradecimentos por todo o empenho pelo evento, em nome de todos. E, claro, o FSB Suelen.
Obrigada, professor Isaías. Por favor, não se retire da mesa por enquanto, porque você faz parte desse projeto com a gente. Você tem sido nossa inspiração, particularmente falando, né, por Renato e por mim. Já falamos no início, né, da conferência de abertura. Professor Isaías de Carvalho foi o fundador do Dinamizando, Ensino de Língua Inglesa na UESC. Eu tive o prazer de ter sido a sua aluna, ter sido sua monitora, a primeira monitora do Dinamizando,
há muito tempo atrás, colega, trabalhamos juntos aqui na UESC, e o professor Renato foi orientando, né, do professor Isaías. Então, nós estamos duplamente honradas e honrados por estar aqui contigo nessa mesa. Então, a gente não poderia finalizar esse evento sem te agradecer publicamente por nos inspirar e por esse evento, na verdade, é fruto de tudo que você nos ensinou, enquanto colega, enquanto professor. O Language Week foi criação nossa. Na minha época, eu estava aqui contigo, com o Renato, então, muito obrigada mais uma vez, vou passar ainda para meus colegas, para também agradecer ao público que está nos ouvindo no canal, a equipe do FORPROLI, que está aí durante todo o evento, colaborando com a gente nos 3 campos da UFSB, os colaboradores, os professores que estão também com a gente, agradeço a presença do professor Gabriel Nascimento, que está aqui no auditório. Então, muito obrigada. Vou passar para os meus colegas, que vocês sabem que eu gosto de falar, né? Então, vou parar por aqui. Professora Valquíria.
Gente, Sueli já falou para todo mundo, tá? Eu só tenho a agradecer. Eu acho que o evento foi um grande aprendizado para nós todos. Aprender a lidar com as tecnologias ao vivo, a gente faz, né, um monte de coisas que não dá certo, mas outras dão certo. Então, acho que foi legal e espero que todos tenham aproveitado bem. Obrigada.
Boa noite a todas, todos aqui na sala e no auditório, na verdade, e também no YouTube. Agradecer as instituições, a UESC, né, que me acolheu, eu estou fazendo aqui o doutorado, a UFSB também, por essa parceria incrível. Não posso deixar também de colocar aqui, além de toda a equipe de professores, toda a rede que a gente tem aqui, os monitores que foram, assim, o ponto principal. Eu sempre falei desde o início, vocês são o coração desse evento, ajudaram muito, e todos os convidados que estão aqui, né, representados aqui pela professora Paula também, muito obrigada pela sua presença aqui. É isso, agradecer só por esse evento lindo. E passo agora para o professor Renato.
Boa noite, pessoal. Eu gostaria de agradecer a parceria que a gente tem mantido há muito tempo, né? Como a professora Suelen falou, sou filho da casa, fui orientando do professor Isaías desde o dia em que eu vim me matricular na graduação. Então, é uma relação que a gente já mantém há 12 anos ao todo, né? De desorientação, né? Porque ele é desorientador. E essa parceria, né? O Gabriel foi meu veterano, na época que eu cheguei, e a gente tem essa existência há muito tempo. A universidade é uma casa, a nossa universidade aqui é uma casa que tem bem formado a todos nós. A professora Suelen também é formada aqui, que foi para o UFSB, a professora de lá também estive lá. Então, são essas relações que a gente foi criando, esses laços, esses afetos. E, com isso, também gostaria de agradecer a todo o suporte da UFSB, em nome de Ítalo, também de Gabi, que tem feito muito o trabalho digital, de Mel no UESC English, e o nome de Arthur aqui do nosso auditório, que tem contribuído. A transmissão não teria acontecido se não fosse Arthur, Juan, Eric e Pedro, são pessoas que estão ali por trás das câmeras, estão literalmente por trás das câmeras, estão participando, são pessoas que deram todo esse suporte, o suporte também dos professores Carol e também do professor Sérgio, né, de Teixeira, Cerqueda, de Teixeira e de Porto Seguro, respectivamente, e também de Vinícius, que foi o grande suporte, né, a cabeça dos monitores ali no CSC, no campus de Porto Seguro, que são pessoas que a gente pôde contar. E o professor Givanildo aqui no CJA, que é da CEPLAC, aqui na cidade de Ilhéus também. E que também é da nossa universidade, egresso daqui da instituição. Então, são relações que nós fomos construindo. O evento que nós apresentamos para vocês em 3 dias, em 9 turnos, é resultado de relações de década. De mais de uma década, né? Se a gente for contar tudo isso, é mais de uma década. Eu agradeço muito a oportunidade de vocês terem estado aqui ao longo de todo esse tempo, terem abraçado junto conosco, né? Toda a participação, inclusive enfrentando as dificuldades que nós tivemos como portão fechado hoje, mas também é isso mesmo, a luta está aí para a gente lutar, com certeza. Muito obrigado. E a professora Suelen agora.
Só para finalizar, já está tarde, sabemos, queria agradecer a todas as pessoas que estão no YouTube, estavam nos acompanhando aí, fazendo comentários, agradecendo por essa oportunidade do evento, mas eu não posso deixar de finalizar esse evento também agradecendo aos decanos, né, do CJA, professor Fernando, o professor Francisco, do CSC, que nos proporcionaram, né, coffee breaks em ambas instituições, então a parceria também, colaborando com diárias, enfim, a UESC, eu sou suspeita para falar, né, vocês lembram no primeiro dia que eu confundi onde eu trabalhava, falei aqui, porque para mim tem sido uma única instituição já há muito tempo, mesmo antes de entrar na UFSB, eu já tinha um carinho pela proposta da universidade. E estando na UESC, eu costumo brincar, né? Eu saio da UESC, mas ela não sai de mim. Então, é uma parceria para a vida. E agora, né, com essa equipe que vocês estão vendo aqui na mesa, com a equipe de monitores, que a gente já agradeceu muito pessoalmente, mas reiteramos aqui o nosso agradecimento, profunda gratidão por vocês terem contribuído com a gente. Sem vocês, não teria acontecido nada disso. Continuaria o sonho no papel. Então, mais uma vez, muito obrigada. Boa noite, tenham um bom descanso e até 2026. Obrigada.
Vamos juntar para tirar uma foto. Essa equipe linda.
Gente, para organizar um evento desse, vocês envolveram gente de
Vamos um pouco mais para cá. São as duas instituições, postando mais para cá.
falta.
Obrigado. Pode subir. Vem outra vez. Vem todo mundo.
Vem, Gabriel.
Arthur! A gente está muito conectado.
Não vou dar de novo, hein?
Arthur!
Ele deixou muito
Bonito a gente está dando.
ainda, viu, gente? Eu vi a Arthur quando era baby, muito criança. Hoje esse cara tá muito tamanho.
Mel?
Vai todo comigo. É melhor que eu não falar.
Pronto?
3.
Peraí, é o segundo toque.
Ai, agora vai ensinar.
Aqui, ó. Nada, foco automático, aperta. De leve, ele vai focar, você aperta a foto e tirou a foto. Não tem drama. Rapidinho de aula de. Não, rapidinho de aula toda de Juliana, meu Deus. Não tem Aí, tá vendo? A melhor foi essa com a mamãe.
Ele vai ficar aqui. Deixa eu tirar uma selfie, gente.
Volta. Vamos tirar a
Vamos fazer uma despojada? Mas é cara. Ele.
E aqui, a minha novidade,
Tchauzinho, tchauzinho.
vídeo de tchau, Eita.
Ele que de comunicação.
Vai dar tchau, é um vídeo pra sair no Rios.
Midiático.
É muito rede social. 3, 2, foi. Chegou a ser estranho. Chegou a ser estranho. Ai, eu não sei hoje que eu tô lesionado.
Lesionade.
Eu tô achando incrível a vibe de vocês.
Como foi que aconteceu isso?
Depois eu
Quebraram o Gabriel.
Pra me quebraram. Primeiro tá. Não,